Precise figures are elusive, but it seems that about 250 people may have been killed in the collapse of a building where Bangladeshi workers made Western clothing. Household name companies are now suddenly publicity shy, for the tragedy raises some nasty questions. Whose fault is it? The factory bosses who kept people in one of the poorest countries on earth at their machines despite warnings? The companies that constructed an unsafe building? The corruption that seems endemic in Bangladesh? The Western retailers whose appetite for profits keeps the orders rolling? You and me and the rich world's guiltless pleasure in consumption? Andrew North, who was in Bangladesh last week filming about this industry, reports.
The full scale of this catastrophe is still emerging. The UK's Primark, just one of many Western retailers buying clothes from factories inside the collapsed building. The company says it's shocked and saddened by what happened. But critics say the Bangladeshi garment industry was already cracking at the seams. Romana Begum has paid the price too. Thanks to the West's appetite for cheap clothes, she had a steady job in the industry. But then her daughter Mukta started work in a factory too. And just a week later, the Tazreen plant caught fire, killing her and more than 100 other workers. From the charred ruins emerged evidence of rampant cost-cutting and safety abuses. Nearly 6 months later, no one's been prosecuted or even arrested. Still living near the abandoned factory, Romana's life is in ruins too.
I couldn't work after she died. Now I have to because we are in debt. If I ever see the owner, I'll burn him alive. Just like he burnt my child to ash and emptied a mother's chest.
The industry has grown fast, too fast, say some, with new factories opening all the time. Attracted by its cheap labour, British retailers have flocked here. Turning Bangladesh into its bargain tailor of choice. At this factory, they make nearly 20 million garments a year for major British brands. This plant is known for its high standards. And when the clothes leave here, they're ready to be put straight on the shelves. You could say this is Bangladesh's industrial revolution. Making cheap clothes for the UK and other Western markets now employs millions of people. It's also helped to empower Bangladeshi women. But the industry is under constant pressure to keep costs down. And while this is one of the better factories, in others, the practices that led to the fire still continue. The capital, Dhaka, is full of smaller factories where safety standards and working conditions are much worse. To keep costs down, it's an open secret that many companies often subcontract to these sweatshop operations. But checking up is almost impossible. We've learned that there are many backstreet operations in this part of Dhaka doing subcontracting work for other factories, including one that has business with the UK. The only way to see for ourselves is to use concealed cameras. And some of our team are going to go inside, posing as local businessmen. The way in is also the only exit if there's a fire. Buckets of sand, the only equipment for fighting a blaze. On the shop floor, we see children working, flouting the official ban. The owner says almost all his work is subcontracted from other factories that use him secretly to fulfill their orders. And some of the clothes made here have been destined for the UK. Even for factories with the best reputations, the pressure is growing. Here, they insist everything is done in-house with no subcontractors.
Our existing customers, they are more vigilant now. They are frequently visiting with notice, unnoticed, and we are also ourselves motivating people. We are on high alert. We are taking different kind of initiative. Definitely, this is a wake-up call for us.
So do you think that there needs to be more government regulation?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we have a regulation, but the implementation is not there.
From the offices of her small labour union, Nazma Akhtar campaigns for better conditions and workers' rights. It's risky work. Last year, one organiser was found murdered. The case still unsolved. But she says Western buyers are complicit too for turning a blind eye to the industry's cut-price practices.
The buyers are showing they are sleeping, but reality they are not sleeping. So they know all the things in the behind what's going on, but they are showing they doesn't know anything. So the double face should be changed. That is also important because they are always cutting price and asking the better compliance.
But some factories still have questions to answer. We follow one of the government's new fire inspection teams on their rounds. This plant also makes clothes for the UK. Then they test a smoke alarm. But it doesn't work. It's an embarrassing and potentially deadly lapse. The plastic seals are still on the battery. With so many Bangladeshis on the wrong side of the tracks in this densely populated country, it desperately needs the jobs the clothes business provides. The government says it's determined to improve conditions and to close down the worst factories. But his message to Western countries is, don't push us too hard.
If they really want to have this the human rights to be maintained, that is the biggest human right for survival, rights for having a better life. So that is what is very important. And number two is they must be also ready to pay us the real wages.
It's not clear, though, if any extra money would actually reach the people who need it most. Six months since her daughter's death, Ramana finally builds up the courage to visit her grave. Now, hundreds of other Bangladeshis are mourning. And the price of feeding the West's hunger for cheap clothes keeps rising.
Well, now to talk about this, we're joined by Jeff Banks, who's a fashion designer and a retailer who launched the high street chain Warehouse and later presented the BBC's Clothes Show. He now sells his clothes through stores, including Debenhams. Catherine Hammett is a designer who's campaigned since the 1980s for better ethics within the fashion industry. And Rushanara Ali is a Labour MP and a shadow minister for international development. She was born in Bangladesh. Jeff Banks, who do you think benefits most from this trade?
I think it's 50-50. I think there is a desire in the West to keep on buying economical clothes. I think we're all guilty of it. I would like to say I think that the clothing industry generally tonight is grossly ashamed of what's gone on in the last week in Bangladesh, And I think it's actually had a riveting effect on a lot of chief executives as to the way they handle their business going forward. So regrettably, it has had an effect. On the other side, I do believe that nations that are actually endeavouring to pull themselves up by the bootstraps do look forward to this kind of manufacturing, and I'm afraid these indiscretions, even though the majority of companies retain companies to look after the efficiency with which things are dealt with, some slip through the net.
Yeah, okay. Catherine Hamlett, who do you think benefits from this trade?
From this?
Yes.
The people at the top of the big brands, the people that's floating around in their 100 million quid yachts.
But you would accept that it does, clearly in terms of employment and national income, it does have benefits for a country like Bangladesh, this trade?
Well, it's one of their biggest exports, I think, but the way that the workers are paid, they're treated, it's hard to say whether they're better off. I mean, I suppose they just manage to eat, but a lot of this manufacturing goes on in export processing zones which are actually exempt from even local labour laws, and any dissent or any demands for higher wages or effects at collective bargaining can be suppressed by the military. So it's got a hell of a long way to come.
Roshanara, you would accept that a lot of this is to do with corruption in Bangladesh and people not implementing regulations which should be implemented. It's not entirely the fault of Western retailers.
Well, I think that the fault lies with both the companies of those countries like Bangladesh as well as the businesses, Western businesses that are involved. And I do believe that they have a much greater responsibility to work towards having basic minimum standards. These are multi-billion-pound operations around the world in garments factories. If they exerted their influence and power for ensuring that those conditions are met, then you would have better results. Countries like Bangladesh need the inward investment.
Sure.
The governments would take action if business applied its pressure appropriately. That's not happening. It's very piecemeal what they do. I've seen some of the work they've done. There is good work, but it's very, very, very insignificant compared to the scale of the problem.
But in the case of this particular tragedy, we know that there was a crack in the building, that there were warnings given about it. The warnings were ignored. People were compelled to go to work. What responsibility is that of a British or other European retailer or importer?
Well, there should be, I believe that there should be international agreements on basic minimum labour standards and conditions within which businesses can operate effectively. Because it is true that businesses can't enforce those changes on their own, but they have a very important role to play. And reputationally, there is huge damage to businesses and their brands. So it's not really in the interest of the businesses or the countries concerned. If there's a case of irresponsible capitalism, this is a very clear example of it. And I think businesses need to step up.
Hinted that some businesses are beginning to recognise that. Do you think?
Well, I think many of the companies named there, Next, Tesco, they employ a group called Savaru that are based in Hong Kong, that have 170,000 employees that are retained to go and ensure that standards of minimum wages, hospital arrangements, number of toilets per head, all of those things are actually abided by, and they would advise companies to withdraw should those not be complied with. The question mark over this building is, would that organisation have had a structural engineer look at the safety of the building? And I actually think not.
We just don't know, do we?
We don't know. But having said that today, Alan Leighton, who's the chairman of Matalan, issued a directive to all of his procurement people that in future that has to be added to the list.
Okay, the comparison is that you think about old sweatshops in this country or weaving factories and the like. Conditions were pretty terrible. Could we ever expect realistically to have similar conditions in the developing world to the sort of conditions we would expect to take for granted here, Catherine Hamlett?
Well, I think that we should have similar standards. I mean, I think that we should have a decent minimum wage, we should have freedom of association, access to healthcare, building regulation checks now, and I think that actually you can have legislation in those countries, but it doesn't seem to work. I think we actually need to have legislation in our countries that goods coming into our countries are certified to these standards and that they're inspected properly to force the change. The problem is the big brands are really happy. I mean, a Chinese government official told me once that the reason that they haven't improved their labour standards, that their human rights, is that the big brands are pressuring them not to.
Right. The key thing here is going to be public opinion. I just want to play a little piece of tape here, because this afternoon my colleague Zoe Conway went out to talk to the people who just outside Primark, actually, and their views are quite interesting. It's very short. Let's just listen to it.
Have you heard about the factory that's collapsed in Bangladesh?
No.
200 people have been killed, and one of the shops that they supply to is Primark.
I didn't know that.
Will that, do you think, affect whether you go to Primark again?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because that's outrageous. If I'd have known that before I'd gone in, I probably wouldn't have gone in.
Why do you shop in Primark?
Because it's cheap.
For the price.
And do you worry about where and how it's made?
No, not at all. What a pity, but not at all.
And do you ever think about where they're made?
Yes, I know they're made in Bangladesh, and I've also heard the news about the building that collapsed yesterday. In fact, I'm a lecturer and I was talking about it today.
So why did you still buy them?
It doesn't say these are made in Bangladesh. I don't know where they're made.
What have you been buying?
I bought some socks, just some basic clothes like a t-shirt. Yeah, just basic things.
And what did you make of this story when you saw the pictures of that factory collapse? More than 200 people have died.
I was horrified. I felt really bad for them, but then at the same time I feel it's quite hard, like a person alone, not buying a t-shirt in one shop will really make a difference.
But what if everyone stopped buying the t-shirts?
I hope they do. I hope they do. But I don't think that time will come soon.
It's quite interesting. We've got a different attitude to clothes, haven't we? To the fact that you should be able somehow to buy cheap clothes. They're not intrinsically cheap, are they?
I think they're cheap. I think that when you look at prices back in the 80s, that if you look at the price of a Lewin shirt, for instance, at 20 quid these days, it was probably 79 quid back in the 80s. So the cost of clothing relative to the rest of the economy has remained permanently cheap. That's the desire of the consumer. Now, I think it's interesting what those people are saying, that I think if you don't comply socially, I think the consumer will vote with their wallet. I think a lot of people will be turned off Primark as a result. The one thing I'd like to say is that only 35 years ago, in streets not too far from here, was the centre of the rag trade, with sweatshops on every floor. In 1976, the minimum leaving age for a schoolgirl was raised from 15 to 16. Prior to that, you could go in there and there would be rows of 15-year-olds sitting on sewing machines. So what we expect in the West is that the rest of the planet will suddenly catch up with the situation today. So when Catherine talks about Chinese situation, in fact, the Chinese Textile Development Council employ over 2,500 people that look after the way human rights are actually activated in China. And a lot of the manufacturing that you go to now, the quality and standard of manufacturing and factories there is higher than you would certainly get in a lot of Western European factories.
Let's just leave the Chinese, because we're at a bit of a loss in specific regulations in China. But when you look at this question of the consumer pressure and you look at this industry, do you believe that such a thing as an ethical rag trade is feasible?
Well, I think consumers are driving it, and I think that the rag trade by itself would probably have done nothing. But increased consumer awareness of these issues is making people to not buy things because they're concerned about where they come from and how they're made. I mean, Marks and Spencer's have got figures on this which are surprisingly high. Something like 60% of consumers have not bought something because of these kind of concerns. And I disagree. You know, these are the ones who are actually driving the industry to reform. And I think that clothes have come down and they are incredibly cheap but they're not cheap when you consider that the true cost is being paid in human suffering and environmental degradation at the bottom of the supply chain.
Krishnara, when you look at the role of governments and international institutions, whether the EU or the British government or anything, what can they do?
Well, I think that they have a very important responsibility to set the standards. We've seen that with child labour, for instance. You know, 15 years ago, there was a huge amount of concern about child labour. Some progress has been made there because the international community came together. Companies worked together with the governments to try and effect change. You need people to campaign. You need governments to act. I think it does concern me, the comments that Jeff has made, because if we don't have high expectations, we're never going to change anything. And the idea that people's lives should be at risk in those countries is just unacceptable. I represent the constituency that had the rag trade. That doesn't make it okay that you have the kinds of deaths and destruction in factories in those countries, and the pay is less than £1 a week in some of these places. The majority of garments workers are women. It's clear that those countries do need the investment, they need the economic development, but you cannot have the kind of damage to people's lives that what we've seen, not just in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, numerous accidents. So we need business to work responsibly with governments, and we need international agreements that are properly honoured, and businesses will need to be required to act if they don't show results, and we haven't seen the kind of results we need to save lives
that you've
and to
actually
protect
got
people.
An organisation which employs 170,000 people acting on behalf of companies like Tesco and Next that are actually ensuring that the requirement and that...
But they're the exemplars. They need to...
No, they're not.
They're not?
They're standard. It's the odd few that are not necessarily doing it. And again, the restriction in laws, it happened in India that the law was changed about people and responsibilities in employment and pensions, and immediately hundreds of Indian factories closed down and they went into small outdoor worker units to avoid tax. The governments locally can do a lot to assist.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.